Welcome back, guys. In our last video we talked about scope, and we talked about global scope, which contains variables that are defined at the top level of your file and are also accessible anywhere in the file. We also talked about local scope, which are variables that are defined inside of a function and can only be accessed inside of that function. So in this video we'll be looking at how you can modify global variables locally and how you can modify enclosing variables. Just for example, suppose we have a variable with the name of count and it has a value of 0. So we have a function that is increasing count. Let's call the name of this function increment. Okay, so inside of the increment function, we update count to be equal to 1. Okay, so now let's invoke the increment function and let's print count. So if we run this now, okay, we do not pass anything inside of our print function. Increments, is it? Okay, that's the correct spelling. That is the function of my spell check extension. If you want that same function, you can install the extension. Okay, so if we run this now, you see that even though in our increment function we've increased count to be equal to 1, but outside of the function we still have count to be equal to 0. So why could that be? Why is it not being updated to 1? The reason for that is that, just as we discussed in our last video, this count is defined globally, while this count is defined locally. So when we invoke this print function, this count is referring to this global count and it doesn't have access to the local count. So effectively what we have now is we have two different variables that happens to bear the same names, but they are entirely different. So this print function only has access to the global count. It doesn't have access to the local count. But in situations like this, where you actually want to update a global variable locally, how do you do that? So how do you tell Python that you are not actually creating a new variable locally, but you want to update the value of the global variable? How do you do that? You do that using the global keyword. Anytime you want to update a global variable locally, you use the global keyword. So you have global, then followed by the name of the variable that you intend to update locally. So now the name of our variable is count. With this now, you can easily update the value of count because you have specified to Python that you want to modify the global counts and not creating an entirely different variable. So if we print this now, we are going to see that count now is 1 and not 0 as we have the other time. So this is how you update a global variable. Now, what if you are dealing with an enclosing function, an enclosing variable? So let's say you have a variable that is existing in an enclosing scope. And to have an enclosing scope, that means you are going to have a function inside of another function. So for example, we can comment this out now. We are done with updating, modifying global variable. So let's say inside of the increment function we have, okay, we can actually use count again. Let's comment this out. We don't need that for now. So let's say count is equal to 1 in our increment function, and inside of the increment function we have another function so that we can have an enclosing scope. So we can call the name of this function double increment. You can say double increment. All right, this is a function. We have a colon, and inside of the double increment we can have another variable with the name of count also, and we say count is not equal to 6. So inside of count we can, okay, inside of the increment function now we can print count and see what we have. So we are printing count. Take note that this print statement is not inside of the double increment function. This count is inside of the double increment function, as we can see with the indentation, but this is inside of the increment function. Okay, now we are printing count. If we, let's get rid of this line. If we invoke the increment function now, so what do we have as the count value? If you run that, So in situations like this, if you actually want to update an enclosing variable inside of an inner function, how do you do that? Just like we have in our global variable, just as we have when updating the global variable, you can also update an enclosing variable using another keyword of non-local. Non-local is another keyword, is another name for enclosing. So you are, with this keyword now, you are telling Python that you actually want to update the variable that is existing in the enclosing scope, and you are not creating another variable in this function. So you have the non-local keyword followed by the name of the variable. So with this now, you are telling Python that, okay, I want to actually update this enclosing variable that is existing in the enclosing scope, and I'm not creating another variable here. So if we invoke this function now of double increment, let's invoke the function double increment. Okay, let's print this now. Okay, so we can now see that count has been updated to 6. But if without this line, if we run this now, we've invoked double increment function, which is supposed to update count to be 6, which is supposed to assign 6 to count. So if you run this now, you are going to see that count is 1. But as soon as you use the non-local keyword, just like the global keyword, as soon as you use this now, so it's going to update count to be equal to 6. That means you are reassigning another value to this variable, and you are not effectively creating another variable inside of your double increment function. So that's how you modify both global variable and enclosing variable, which you can also refer to as non-local. But you should note that even though you have this option of updating global variables locally, it is in your best interest that you should avoid updating global variables locally. It is not advisable. Whenever as you are updating global variables locally, you are indirectly introducing bugs into your code, because, for example, this count variable that is existing locally, it can be used in many other places, possibly in 10 or 20 different places in your code base, which you are not aware of. And as soon as you are updating it in your local functions, you are indirectly creating bugs inside of your code base. So it is better you avoid updating global variables locally. I know the question in your mind now is, what if you actually need to update global variables? If you need to modify it, the best thing to do is to return your value that you want to use as the update. You can return it from that function, and then you assign it to the global variable globally. Just here now, just like here, as you have these counts, we can delete this so we have a cleared space. So instead of using the global keyword to update count, you can say, let's introduce a condition here. You can say if, let's say, count is less than 2. This is just to illustrate how you can modify your global variable without modifying it locally. So you can say if count is less than 2, which is actually true now because count is 0. So you can say return whatever value you want to update to. Let's say you want to update it to 5, so you can say return 5. Okay, this is supposed to be indented inside of the if statement. Now, as you return 5 here now, so you can say count is now equal to increment. So as soon as you run this now, this increment function is going to return 5, which will now be assigned to the count function. This is more error-free than modifying your variables locally, because with this now, if anything goes wrong, it can be easily detected than the other time. Okay, so if you run this now, you see that you can also print, let's print count. Print count. Okay, so if we run this again, what do we have? You see now that count is also 5. You are achieving the same results using different method. Now you are not updating count locally, you are still updating it globally. Another thing in best practice, the first one we talked about, is you should avoid updating global variables locally. So another thing is you should ensure that you use clear descriptive names for your variables so that any other person that is working in your code base can easily understand what your variable is working for. Another thing you should take note of when you are working with variables in different scopes is that you should avoid using the same name in different scopes. Just like you have the name of count, the variable of count in the global scope, avoid using the same name locally. That will avoid confusion whenever you want to try to understand how your code is being executed. Using the same name in different scope, like in the global scope and in the local scope, it's going to create confusion. Possibly in the next 2 months, you want to understand how your code is working, or possibly you run into error, you run into bugs, and then you want to try to understand how the code is being executed. Using different names in different scope will save you the stress, it will save you the confusion. But if you use the same name in the global scope and also in the local scope, that is going to introduce some confusion when you are trying to understand how your code is being executed. Alright, so that's that about modifying variables in global and local scope. You use the global keyword for global variables and you use the non-local keyword for enclosing variables. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel. I will see you in the next lesson.